Good morning and welcome. We are so pleased you could join us today for this joint WITA event in partnership with the U.S. Council for International Business. Before we turn to today's discussion of efforts to create standards for governance of artificial intelligence, we want to flag a new event that we hope to formally announce later today, a hybrid event on June 18th in partnership with the Wilson Center hosting Senator Chris Coons to discuss the reauthorization of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. We hope to be able to post information on that event later today on our website, www.wita.org. You can find information on all of WITA's upcoming events on our website, including our exciting new event at the WTO in Geneva in September, where WITA will be hosting a reception with Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO. As you know, if you've joined us for any of our past webinars, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on today's Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. So welcome today to Carolina Walczak at MasterCard in Brussels, Ibrahim Aminu with the Regional Sustainability Energy Center of Excellence in Abuja, Nigeria, Jingji Fu at the China Mission to the WTO in Geneva, and Hai Pham at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Welcome, Carolina, Ibrahim, Jingji. Hi, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you should have received an email with today's program and a link to our panelist biographies. You can also ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can during today's session. We have a great lineup today with several new speakers on the WITA webinar platform, including Karine Perset, the head of the AI unit at the OECD's AI at Digital Economy Policy Division, David Turnbull, the U.S. delegate to the OECD's Digital Policy Committee and GPAI, Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the Office of Multilateral Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. I know when I got out of grad school, that department did not exist. Howie Wachtel, the Senior Director and Head of the UN and International Organizations Policy at Microsoft, and Kate Goodlow, Managing Director at BSA, the Business Software Alliance. We're also pleased to welcome back to the WITA webinar platform our friend Dr. Orit Frenkel, the CEO of the American Leadership Initiative, and our moderator and today's event partner, Cheryl Miller, Vice President of Digital Policy at the U.S. Council for International Business. Big thanks to Cheryl for coming to WITA with this idea. We want to encourage all of you, if you have ideas for WITA events, to please come to us. And if we are able to make it work with our schedule, we're happy to consider it. So thank you very much, Cheryl, for bringing this to us. And thanks to all our panelists for joining us today.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to our esteemed panel of experts. I'm very excited to kick this off. Just to let you all know, USCIB, I'm happy to announce, has launched our AI webpage. And on that webpage, you can also find an AI priorities paper that we've published. We've been doing a lot of great work around AI, and our members have been hard at work around it as well. Many of us are just coming back from the WSIS Plus 20 high-level event in Geneva, as well as the AI for Good conference. And so I think that this discussion is going to be very timely. We'd like to keep it as conversational as possible. So I will just dive in and ask questions to our panelists. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get started. So first question I have, just to kick things off, the OECD ministers recently approved a revised set of AI principles, which updated the groundbreaking 2019 AI principles to take into account technological advancements. Some people participating in this webinar may not be familiar with the updated OECD AI principles. So what are important improvements in these revised guidelines that the global community should understand and hopefully embrace? Karine, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks a lot for that question, Cheryl, and for the invitation to be here today. So when they were adopted in 2019, the OECD AI principles were the very first intergovernmental standard on AI and represented a broad consensus and a high-level commitment of OECD governments and partner governments. In 2020, so 5 years on, in 2024, there was wide agreement amongst our member countries, partner countries, and stakeholders to revise these principles. They overall stood the test of time, but there were a few reasons to update them. to modify them. First was really to clarify and simplify definitions and principles in a clear but technically accurate way, because we realized as they were being used that, you know, that they were being used a certain way that was not necessarily always intended. So really to clarify and simplify, and then so stakeholders could better, and member countries could better implement and understand them. And then second, OECD members felt the need to reflect AI developments over the past 5 years, such as particularly the emergence of large language models and generative AI in late 2022, and to be as future-proof as possible. And the third was really to align with current priorities of adherence to the principles, particularly on misinformation, information integrity, safety, and transparency. And so, and then improving the accountability, strengthening the accountability principle as a building block for most of our follow-on work to the principles, particularly in the context of responsible business conduct, was another reason. So on that basis, adherence agreed to make some specific updates, and I'll just point to 4 key revisions to ensure the principles remain relevant, robust, and fit for purpose. So the first one is really about the addressing new safety concerns, so that if an AI system risks causing undue harm or exhibits undesired behavior, there are robust mechanisms and safeguards exist to override, repair, or decommission them safely. The second reflects the growing importance of addressing mis and disinformation and safeguarding information integrity, and this is in the context of generative AI and of elections in many countries. And third, they underscore the need for jurisdictions to work together to promote interoperable governance, not equal governance, not the same thing, but interoperable terminology, interoperable concepts for governance, and policy environments for AI, because especially as the number of AI policy initiatives worldwide surges, and that's my full-time job, and I'm having trouble keeping up with them. So I can just imagine so it's difficult to follow everything that's happening, and therefore we need to at least try to speak the same language when we're talking about AI policies. Fourth, as I mentioned, they really emphasize responsible business conduct throughout the AI ecosystem, including in cooperation with upstream suppliers of AI knowledge and AI resources like AI compute, and AI investors as well, and then other stakeholders and downstream actors like AI users that could be medical device manufacturers or electricity plants or anything basically, or any type of business. And lastly, the principles explicitly now reference environmental sustainability, because that concern they already did emphasize sustainable development, but now they specifically emphasize environmental components, because that has grown, the importance of that has grown considerably over the past 5 years. So they were adopted formally at the beginning of May, just a few weeks ago, at the OECD. And so what's interesting now, with 47 adherents, including the European Union, and a general scope that ensures applicability to AI developments around the world, the principles now provide a blueprint for policy frameworks on how to address AI risks and shape AI policies, combined, of course, with a lot of tools that we're developing on each of these principles to help implement them. And it's also worth noting that the OECD recommendation, the principles, the OECD AI principles also include a new definition of an AI system that's been taken up by the EU and the Council of Europe in its Framework Convention, and of course by others, NIST, and starting with the US AI Act initiative back in 2020, and its life cycle were updated as well, just to simplify them. So that's about it for the update to the principles.
Thank you so much. David, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks to you and Ken for having us here today. It's a real privilege to be a part of this esteemed panel. Really brief chapeau before I start. Again, I'm David Turnbull. I'm in our Multilateral Affairs Office here at the new Cyberspace Bureau at State. I just wanted to give kind of a brief chapeau of like why the United States really values this work that's ongoing at the OECD and other forum. And part of that is really our commitment to the multi-stakeholderism, which is engaging with business partners like you all, and the multilateral approach, which is helping us realize the opportunities of the digital age while mitigating the risks. And so some of you may have seen we recently launched this digital solidarity strategy as part of our new cyberspace strategy. And really what this means in a nutshell is the willingness to work together on shared goals, to stand together and to help our partners build capacity and provide mutual support. So for us, that means a positive, proactive foreign policy on technology issues at the OECD, the UN, and other multilateral fora. And it's a recognition that there's an urgency to address these global challenges and capture the benefits from this increasingly ubiquitous technology. And now the OECD AI recommendation is, of course, a huge part of that. And really, Korean's work on this can't be understated. This was nearly a 2-year effort to get the revisions through. And so we put a lot of work into that AI system definition, so definitely recommend taking a look at that. But we, the United States, have long been a champion of the OECD AI recommendation, which was really the first set of intergovernmental principles related to AI. And we were very pleased to welcome the updates this spring. So in addition to all of the good changes that Corrine mentioned, I'll just give the US perspective on this, which was what we advocated for was the inclusion of 5 additional topics in the recommendation to bring it up to speed with both the technological and the policy developments since 2019. So in particular, we were very pleased with the inclusion of human rights in this document, references to algorithmic bias and combating bias in AI, also the inclusion of language on information integrity. As you may know, the United States and France are co-chairing something called the Information Integrity Hub at the OECD, looking at the impact of mis and disinformation. And of course, AI is playing an increasingly large role in both the creation and dissemination of mis and disinformation. So that's an important focus for us, particularly in this large election year. Of course, the inclusion of generative AI, that was a key component of the update, and then reference to intellectual property rights. And of course, that's a rapidly developing sphere as well. So we hope that the inclusion of these elements not only keeps the recommendations central in the debate on AI governance, but also ensures alignment with democratic values. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David. And just to piggyback on that a little bit, we at USCIB, we appreciate we have a special relationship with the OECD, and we and our members really feel it's critical that stakeholders have a seat at the table in any discussion on AI governance, policy, and regulations. We want to make sure that business ensures that the outcome is commercially viable. We need the technical community to advise about technical feasibility. We need civil society to ensure that there's adequate protection of human rights and personal privacy. And finally, governments to take these inputs into account and develop policy and regulations. The OECD has been at the forefront of this, as we're hearing and we're learning, and the UN still remains government-driven. I think most of us would agree on that. My question is, how can we leverage the opportunities presented by the UN's consideration of the Global Digital Compact and report of the high-level advisory body on AI to make the business voice heard on AI governance and ensure that we hang on to a seat at the table? And so, altering my question a little bit, turning now to Howie, if you'd like to help us. I know Microsoft has been very involved in the discussions and would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, happy to, and thanks again for having me on the panel, Cheryl. I mean, I think where I'll start is the good news is that the processes surrounding the UN Global Digital Compact and the Summit of the Future and the negotiation of the Pact for the Future have been very open to multi-stakeholder participation. So it has kind of been a breath of fresh air that there have been several opportunities for the multi-stakeholder community to receive briefings from the co-facilitators of these different negotiations. There have been several opportunities to provide oral or written remarks, and even opportunities most recently for civil society and the private sector and academia to attend a recent UN Civil Society conference in Nairobi. So I think the good news is that these processes have sort of stood out compared to other robust UN processes in their willingness to accept input and feedback from private sector participants. So that's the good news. I think zooming out, what we're sort of seeing in New York is there are 5 disparate work streams that will eventually converge and kind of come together by September on AI governance, among other issues. So you, I think, rightly pointed out the Global Digital Compact, and then also the Pact for the Future. There's certainly the U.S. authored resolution at the UN on AI. There's currently a Chinese draft focused on AI development that's still with UN member states. And then, of course, there's, as you mentioned, the work of the high-level advisory body on AI, which is expected to produce a final report later this summer. And I think what's sort of been interesting to see is how all of these things are kind of coming together, sometimes clumsily, and there's a lot that we still don't know. But recently, I thought it was interesting to see the UN Secretary General and his remarks at the AI summit in Seoul kind of start to lay out his vision, which seemed to include elements from the high-level advisory body on AI, elements from the draft Global Digital Compact, and some other bits and pieces. And he focused on big ideas like the creation of this international scientific panel on AI, the creation of an international contact group on AI governance, a potentially new office on digital and emerging technology at the UN that would sort of sit alongside the tech envoy's office. And then finally, kind of this global fund on AI to provide AI capacity building development for global South countries in particular. So, with these kind of 4 ideas out there, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how member states continue to negotiate, the form they take, then to see the input that is added on by the high-level advisory body on AI, and then ultimately, I think we'll have something to see in September. I think for our part, a couple of the big priorities throughout for the private sector have been, as David said, kind of making sure that there's a role for multi-stakeholder participation that is built into these various processes. This is crucially important on something like AI, where you've got such an elevated role that the private sector is already playing. But then also the need for interoperability, right? I mean, we wouldn't want 100 different sets of rules and standards in 100 different countries. So that's sort of been our focus, and I think it'll be interesting to see in the coming weeks and months where all of this lands in September.
Thank you so much, Howie. And Dr. Frenkel, I understand that you have come out with a great paper on AI, and perhaps you have some thoughts as it relates to this question as well. So I turn it to you.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thank you, WITA. Yeah, American Leadership Initiative put out a paper a couple weeks ago on, our focus really is on U.S. leadership on AI global governance. And I think, the work that the OECD, the UN, and other organizations, the G7, are doing is great. I think a lot of that work has been driven by the U.S. and by the standards and priorities, that the U.S. has set. And I think the administration's executive order does a really good job of incorporating a lot of these things. In terms of the UN and the OECD, I think the U.S. should really look for additional opportunities to intensify its work with these organizations. I think the OECD has been really a good leader in terms of laying out the principles. One challenge is that they only, as you said, represent 47 the most developed countries. And we see just this rapid proliferation of AI regulations now throughout the global south. I think Brazil has a vote on its regulations, or might issue some regulations as early as next week, and they're looking pretty problematic. And so I think hopefully the UN can play a role in terms of being more active in working with a lot of other countries in terms of helping them, providing training, but also helping them in shaping their regulatory frameworks. And I think we personally think the US also needs to be more vigorously involved in negotiating bilateral or regional understandings with various other countries.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to turn to Kate to answer, but also I want to elaborate a little bit further because you mentioned standards, and I know BSA has been very involved in the AI work. And so if we could also think about AI governance frameworks, I know from a standards perspective, the IEEE and the ISO have been doing important work in this area. And these are industry-led bodies. I think UN entities such as the ITU will likely also endeavor to set AI standards. And again, the latter work likely will be government-led. How would you recommend approaching standards development to capitalize on the standard-setting organization's work so that it appropriately informs the ITU or other government-led multilateral initiatives?
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you so much for having me today. For those of you who don't know BSA, we are a trade association of the business-to-business software companies. So I often ask folks to think of us as the B2B slice of the technology industry. My role is on our policy team, where I lead our work on artificial intelligence and privacy. So all of these issues are front of mind. Cheryl, I want to answer your question about standards, but I also want to go back to the prior conversation that weaves together these issues with broader AI global governance issues. I mean, on standards, it's hard to understate the importance of having international consensus-based standards that will help drive towards interoperable approaches toward how companies build and deploy AI responsibly. And I think that's an incredibly important issue worthy of much discussion and focus among at least our panel and beyond. But I also want to go back to the prior discussion about sort of how do we set up and drive sort of recognition of international approaches towards establishing principles and concrete recommendations on AI policies, including through the OECD's work. And I wanted to pick up on a point that several other speakers mentioned about the definitions of an AI system that's included in the revised OECD's work, because that is a really key piece of looking at AI governance for someone with my background who comes from a global organization, looking at policy advocates, talking to policymakers all over the world who are all thinking about what's the right way to regulate AI. And when you are thinking with that question in mind, you sometimes say, well, what's AI? And policymakers can spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel, thinking of what's AI. And I think that OECD's work to define in a very concrete way, what is an AI system? And as others have said, that work has been leveraged in the EU. It's been leveraged by NIST. In the US, there's a new state law in Colorado that also builds on the OECD's definition of an AI system. And I think that's really a critical aspect of having interoperable approaches to AI governance, when you can start with a sort of shared understanding of what's AI, so that policymakers can then focus on the next question of which part of the AI landscape am I really focused on looking at here? What's my goal of the regulation or the legislation that I'm proposing, so that you get past the foundational question of how do we define this technology, and you can focus on the next step. And I just wanted to make that point as we think about how these approaches to governance can fit together, both in the policy landscape and elsewhere.
I just wanted to add one point that hasn't been made yet. I mean, I think certainly standards, are critical, but as we look at interoperability and standards development, we have to recognize that, first of all, as we know, there are some differences between the US and the EU approach, but more profoundly, we're also dealing with China's approach, which is much more authoritarian, very different standards in terms of, gathering data, use of data, et cetera. And, and China has been very, very strong in a lot of the government standard setting bodies. And so, we feel that that's really an area that the U.S. needs to, U.S. government needs to devote more priority to. And I think in general, we really need to think about standards and interoperability between kind of the Western democratic countries to really set up more of a bulwark against China's approach and standards.
Maybe
Thank you.
I can.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
No, maybe just to add something which is relevant to standards is that one avenue that that we're driving forward, that we've been driving forward for a couple of years is in the global AI governance space, is really promoting responsible AI without reinventing the wheel, is by applying existing legal instruments that are already in place to cover AI principles. In theory, they already do, but they don't. To date, they have not explicitly. And so we have these responsible business conduct principles that are applied, that have been applied for decades in multiple industries by multiple companies operating internationally, and they cover areas like minerals, textiles, and many sort of sector-specific areas, and they do cover science and technology. And now we're making them much more specific on the AI front. And what's I think quite, there's several advantages with this approach. First, we're not reinventing the wheel. It merges very well with existing standards. The UN actually has an equivalent in the form which is managed by the Office of Human Rights. The European Union has an equivalent as well, and this standard of responsible business conduct covers the AI system lifecycle, but also covers sort of the upstream relationships. So it's kind of more. So, for example, the relationships, the compute, the upstream suppliers, like the compute suppliers, the investors, and it also handles sort of downstream uses of AI systems. So it's quite well accepted, and it's again implemented in all large companies. In addition to that, and this is where I think we haven't given enough thought as a global community, is rights are great, but we need, if we're going to have rights, we need redress that works. There's no point in having rights to non-biased systems if there's nothing we can do about it when a system is biased against us. And this sort of access to redress, not just for those who have an egregious huge harm and who can go and who have a lot of legal support, but for everybody, is really, I think, an important one to focus on in the moving forward.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I know that Orit raised interoperability. She's reading my mind. That was the direction I was going to go to next. And so I'd like to spend maybe another minute on that. We also received some questions in the chat regarding it. USCIB's AI priorities paper maintains that global coherence and interoperability of AI governance is really essential to spreading the benefits of AI as broadly as possible. And Interoperability has been a buzzword, I think, throughout the UN stakeholder consultations on the Global Digital Compact from the very beginning. I think we can agree on that. Reps from the global business community have maintained in these consultations that by using existing AI governance frameworks as a foundation, we're better placed ultimately to realize interoperability and to harmonize regulations and standards across the globe. So this question is a little bit two-part as we shift further into this. How do you think we can really promote greater awareness of the OECD's important instrument to inform policy and regulatory developments at the national and regional levels, as well as at the United Nations? And I do believe at the UN, there may be some pressure to reinvent the wheel in some places. And then related to this, Orit, your paper on US leadership for AI global governance, it addresses the topic of the EU's regulatory advantage. And would love to sort of delve into that next, just to see how do we work to ensure that just as the EU's general data protection regulation sort of became a model that was embraced by many countries, that the EU AI Act doesn't become sort of the de facto global standard for AI governance. And Corinne, I know that you will need to leave soon. If you'd like to take a first stab at this, that would be great.
Yeah, perhaps just a couple points. So this tool that I was mentioning on responsible business conduct, due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, is very, very directly aligned with the US NIST's risk management framework, with ISO's risk management frameworks, with IEEE's risk management frameworks, the 7000 series, and with a number of others. So it's not. It's very interoperable in that sense. It adds a redress component which needs to be probably strengthened, but it is in place. So I think this is a good start in terms of collaboration with the United Nations. I mean, the United Nations have global legitimacy, cover the entire world, and they definitely have an important role to play now. So we're working actively with Amandip Gill and his team, the UN Tech Envoy, on areas where it makes sense to work together, because of course their coverage is much broader, but they might not have resources, or they might not have the background, since 2016, the 8 years of work we've been able to conduct, and the same membership that's able in some cases to act much faster, because of course when you have less countries, it's much easier to agree than the more countries you have, and the more different they are, it makes it a little harder to agree, and maybe a lot harder sometimes. But in any case, I think the values that we established in 2019, it's important to mention that they're reflected in prior and subsequent AI initiatives that build and align with those. So that's a really good that's a really positive development, and it does reflect the value of normative approaches to AI governance. We work with the United Nations, but we also work with a lot of other intergovernmental organizations, the European Commission, of course, and the Inter-American Development Bank, with APEC, with Council of Europe, and with all the standards bodies, ISO, NIST, IEEE, and we participate in their work, and they participate in our work. So they're part of our working groups at the OECD, and vice versa. So I think that also facilitates the speaking the same language, because we're participating in each other's work, and kind of and therefore building that common understanding in many cases. But we do need, there are different roles for different organizations with different mandates. The OECD's role is economic and social. It is, we need to bring together the different strengths of different organizations in a complementary manner to advance AI governance at scale. And that includes, of course, the UN, which has a role to play. Now, I think, yeah, as you said, the important component is really not to invent the wheel, but where are the gaps and where is the UN's unique advantage? And that's kind of the critical question. And it's the question we asked ourselves when we started working, where can we add value? And for example, we've been working on AI incidents and tracking those incidents, bringing the evidence base, well, we keep, we're using anecdotal cases to talk about risks in AI, but what's actually happening? Where are the incidents happening? Are the incidents happening in, are they really biased? What sectors are they occurring, happening in, and so on? So, our value add was really on the sort of evidence-based. Okay, so we develop policies, but we base them on evidence that shows us what direction, what works, what doesn't work. And it's the same thing for all the organizations. They have their mandate and their unique advantages that they bring to the table.
Thank you so much. And David, I'd like to turn to you and add something else that we're getting in from the chat here, just regarding the proliferation of different multilateral forums concerning AI and AI governance. The question is, should we be concerned about the creation of new international supervisory organizations?
Thanks, Cheryl. That's a great question. And there's a few other comments I wanted to respond to also, so I'll try to keep all of this in order. Also just flagging, I posted in the chat the link to the OECD AI Incidents Monitor. That's an absolutely great public tool that got launched in December. It's continuing to be refined right now at the OECD, so definitely check that out. It's publicly available and constantly learning as well, and so that's only going to get better and better for anyone who's looking at AI risk mitigation. I'm glad Karine and others mentioned the NIST risk management framework. I think that's a really important document to highlight when we talk about AI governance and AI standards. NIST has been instrumental, and I think in lockstep with the OECD in trying to build these international standards. And I think it's really important to remember we're at sort of an unprecedented moment in the application of Moore's law with AI. So, we have gone in the span of just a couple of years from like horse and carriage to jet planes. And this is just moving so fast. And even when you compare it to recent developments like the internet and standards like IEEE and ISO and ICANN and some of these other really important bodies, they had longer to develop. And we are, as an international community, are, I think, doing as good a job as we can to try to keep pace with these developments. But governments and multilateral organizations are simply not built at this speed. So we're always going to need those really important inputs from you all, from the private sector. And I think the OECD has been a great place where that multi-stakeholder approach is being applied. In terms of the various proliferation of international fora that are discussing AI governance, look, I mean, we in the United States, we're focused very closely on the UN, the OECD, the G7. And I think, despite this very understandable anxiety about this proliferation of multinational processes and the concern about some states pushing those in different directions and more engagement isn't always productive engagement in those bodies, I would point out. We think the UN can play an important role in fostering the global conversation and serving as an important partner on these issues. But it needs to include the voice of all stakeholders, including industry, and that's really, really important to get things right. So right now, it's a pretty critical period at the UN on tech, including issues being raised at UNGA, ITU, UNESCO, UNDP, and other fora that are talking about AI and cybercrime and a number of these digital issues. Increasingly, we're also talking about data governance and the overlap of that with AI, and that's another, ILO too. Thank you, Karine. And another area where the OECD is also doing a good job looking at the overlap between data governance and AI. And so we need to continue to make progress there in those forums. to see how the UN can affect countries in the international community and leverage these technologies. And then going back to the OECD and the recommendation on AI, this is something we're going to continue to highlight across our engagements. Karine, I think I saw in a different presentation you gave the vast number of international legislations and legal frameworks that have used the OECD recommendation as a foundational model, to borrow a phrase from tech. And we want to make sure that continues as countries are struggling for how to implement governance of AI. From the State Department's very small and hopefully important piece of this, we have something called AI Connect, which is a program that we are doing internationally to encourage the responsible stewardship of AI technologies that's happening across the world. I think we're hosting some programs in Vietnam this year, and that's going to move to a couple of other places in coming years. And this is to engage leaders in industry on the operationalization of these OECD principles to empower lower and middle income countries. And we're grateful for all of the partnership we've received on that. So maybe I'll stop there, but hopefully that answers most of the points. Thanks.
That was great, David. Thank you so much. And Karine, thank you so much for all the work the OECD has been doing. I know we haven't even really scratched the surface, your stewardship on the Hiroshima standards, et cetera. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with before you have to hop off?
Maybe I just emphasize the importance of moving, and we are going there, but maybe moving, trying to move a little faster, or moving not necessarily faster, but in a thorough manner with the input of scientists. And Yoshua Bengio has been leading this amazing report, which an interim version was released of 3 weeks ago before the Seoul Summit, which is a very excellent starting basis, and hopefully that can continue, because it's really important to set. It's kind of the IPCC for AI, bringing together all these scientists into something that is that everybody can understand and can agree to. And it's not off. I mean, I've learned a lot of things by reading that report that I'd strongly encourage others to. And I think that's an initiative that ought to continue under hopefully Yoshua or somebody who has the scientific credibility and gravitas to lead that kind of an effort. So with that, thank you so much for your invitation, and I wish you have a great rest of the conversation. Bye-bye.
Bye, Karine, and thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I do want to add one comment that we received that's an important one, is that the work of UNESCO has also been very strong on AI. They have a business council on ethical AI. Perhaps if we do a similar panel in the future, we might have someone from UNESCO come on board and tell us some more about the work that they've been doing. Orit, I know you've been patiently waiting and you wanted to come in on one of the previous points, and so I'll turn to you next.
Thanks. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, the EU has kind of the first mover advantage in terms of having put its AI Act out. And, as you said, like we saw with GPDR, the first mover frequently has an advantage of becoming a global standard as other countries really companies, try to meet that. And then other countries try to copy it. I think from our perspective, the US regulatory framework, which includes, the EO, NIST, and the AI Bill of Rights, tries to balance a little less regulation, risk management, a little less regulation, and more fostering opportunity for innovation. And I think, that's one of the reasons that we want the U.S. to lead more aggressively in promoting its model, both through, the G7, OECD, UN, as it's been doing, but also more broadly, in other parts of the world. The other point I'll make is that we've had a number of conversations with members of Congress about this. I think they are looking at legislation, and I think we will see some legislation potentially later this year, although this is an election year, so you never know, or in early 2025. And I think that'll help, blunt the EU first mover advantage. But, it is a concern. So thank you for flagging that.
Thank you. And I've been trying to cover as much ground as possible with a lot of questions. So I'm sorry if I'm moving too quickly. That's just my nature. So I would like to turn next to Howie and allow him to elaborate on any of the topics that we've just touched on, because we've covered quite a few different things. And I will add one slight detail coming in from our chat, because I want to make sure that our audience can participate as much as possible. The question is whether or not you can share any observations regarding the overlapping regional and plurilateral initiatives. So, for example, DEPA, DEA, or the UK-Korea Global Safety Summits, and how do we sort of move forward and create more global harmonization there? So, Howie, you can take it away from there.
Yeah, thanks. I think the first thing I'll say, just touching on the whether we should be concerned by the proliferation of these different AI governance initiatives, whether nationally, regionally, or at the UN level. I think the opposite would be far worse, right? I think we've been down this road before with social media, where the response was not to do very much of anything at all. And so I would actually say it's been fairly refreshing to see the proliferation of these various initiatives at every single level and every single layer. So there will obviously be some challenges. There remain lots of challenges in bringing all these pieces together, but I've been pleasantly surprised with the degree to which these different processes are starting to coalesce. I mean, a lot of the language that was used, for example, in the White House voluntary principles kind of made its way into the AI executive order in the US, which was also included in the EU's AI Act. And a lot of that served as the foundation for the G7 AI Hiroshima principles. And now, we're even seeing that a lot of the language that was in the US authored resolution on AI at the UN kind of mirrors a lot of the same principles that were included in the G7 Hiroshima AI principles. So the reality is that a lot of this is coming together in a meaningful way. Now, there are clearly some huge challenges that remain, and I think there's so much great work that's happening clearly at the OECD, but then also at UNESCO and the ITU and UNDP and UNOHCHR that we shouldn't lose sight of. And we want to make sure that there are no attempts to kind of duplicate these existing processes and efforts. But I think it's actually been refreshing to see how these processes are ultimately kind of coming together. And I think it's also kind of important, maybe the distinction between harmonization and interoperability. Had a discussion on interoperability before. When I think of interoperability, I think of kind of the ability of different systems to communicate effectively, to share data. Kind of helps the algorithms on different platforms have a shared understanding, a shared language. Harmonization, I think, more in terms of the legal frameworks that are in place in each of these jurisdictions, and making sure you sort of have a common parlance, from one government to the next, to the extent that the governments are on the same page. But I think big picture, it's been a positive to see the proliferation of these different AI governance initiatives, and refreshing to see some of the language the shared language that's coming together across these different products.
Oh, thank you so much. Kate.
Yes, I just want to pick up on that too. I mean, as these issues really are proliferating, as Howie said, companies who are using and creating AI systems are also looking to, how do we put real structures into place as we do this work? And I wanted to go back to the point that David made earlier about the NIST risk management framework and the importance of that document, because it is becoming such an important touchstone for companies who are doing this work. And it is one that is, rightly gaining a lot of international attention. So we have been very supportive of looking at that as one way of having a cohesive basis for how to think through these issues. And we think NIST's role in putting together that RMF has just been critical to driving recognition of these issues. But I think that also the point David made about the fast pace of all of this policy work and that desire for it to move even faster also touches back to the point we talked about earlier on standards, because I think sometimes when we talk with policymakers, we hear a recognition that there's a lot going on, but they want more, and they want to just set standards within a country about what should be the end result with something, and they want to have country-specific standards. And I know that in the US, that approach goes against the longstanding approach of the United States government in recognizing the importance of international voluntary consensus-based standards and the need to leverage those when possible so that we are not, as others have said, reinventing the wheel. And I think that balance of making sure that we recognize, yes, these issues are important, yes, they are moving fast, and yet the longstanding policies we have that promote the need for these voluntary international consensus-based standards are still appropriate, and they are still the right way to go, even though, and perhaps because these issues are so important and moving so quickly. So I just wanted to tie those connections together.
Kate, thank you so much. And we certainly are trying to balance different things. I would say safety being one of them, which ties into my next question. And we'll start with David. We know that there's been the announcement of an AI safety summit. I believe Secretary Raimondo said it would be hosted by the US in San Francisco later this year. Any thoughts that you have or expectations regarding this summit and the work leading up to it?
Sorry, let me just hit the unmute. Yeah, to echo the secretary, very excited and happy to be hosting the continuation of this. And, to echo what Howie said too, there is a degree of all of these four building off each other and integrating the work of what's going on in the G7 and OECD and the UN. So I don't have anything specific to preview about the summit yet, but I suspect we'll be hearing more from either the White House or Department of Commerce or State on that in the coming weeks and months. But of course, looking to continue the good work that's been going on with our international allies and partners in all of those areas in promoting safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. And that's been, along with the voluntary international consensus base, kind of the guiding principle there. So I don't want to get out ahead of my other colleagues on the topic, but there should be more to come on that.
Thank you so much. And I want to turn next to Orit. In the context of everything we've said so far, what are we missing? Are we missing anything in these AI discussions? Have we sort of covered it all? Are we focusing on certain areas too much at the risk of not giving other areas more attention?
Well, I think that, there's a lot, I think as everyone has described, it's such a big and vast area. I think two things that I'll mention that I think, could use more focus. I mean, as I wanted to say, both the OECD and the other organizations have done a good job, as has the US, but two areas that I think could use more focus. One is workforce and training. And obviously, we don't really know exactly the impact, but we know that AI is going to have a very profound impact on workforce issues. And I think, really doubling down on both education of, upcoming workforce, but training of existing workforce is going to be really, really critical. And, this is obviously something the US needs to focus on, but it's a big international issue as well. And, the ILO has been doing some work, but the US really needs to work more multilaterally to coordinate with other countries, to discuss best practices, et cetera. So I think that's a really vitally important area. The second one, that's been touched on, but can't be overstressed is sort of the values part. And in that, I would include, we talked about democracy, which includes both management of misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes, but also, rules against monitoring and surveillance of populations, use of data, things like that. I would say inclusivity, making sure that AI is available to underserved populations, small, both underserved communities, but also small businesses. We tend to focus a lot on the big companies, but really small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses are going to be the major employers and probably the major movers in terms of innovation. I think those are kind of the main issues that I would, that I think really need. And, human rights, I think that really falls under, making sure that AI is used responsibly. So I think the values and the workforce issues are the two that I just want to mention additional focus on.
Thank you so much for that. And just to add a little bit to that, we've also been having some good discussions on people with disabilities and how we can work on that. And I'd like to turn back to Howie. I know Microsoft has really been a champion in this area and would love to hear a little bit more just directly from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the timing is pretty fortuitous because next week is the Conference of States Parties related to the Convention on Disabilities, Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so, one of the big things that we are pushing for within just the UN Global Digital Compact, for example, is much stronger language on how AI can be used positively on accessibility. And so it's just been a really big focus of ours. So, anything we can kind of do to shine a light on AI positive use cases in these various processes, I think is a positive as we continue to kind of help to shape some of the language in these texts.
Well, I think we've come up against our 1 or 2 minute warning. And so let me turn it back to Ken and thank you all so much. This has been a really, really great discussion.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks to the panel. Just go around if anyone does have any last words on any of the previous comments or on the there's a bunch of questions that came in, guys. We got to as many of them as we kind of wove them into the discussion as we could. We will share those with the panelists. They've seen them, but we'll also email them to them so they'll see the questions that were asked and who asked them. And we really appreciate all the engagement. Again, any last words, anybody? Well, great. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Cheryl, for bringing this to WITA. Orit, great to see you again. Kate, Howie, David, thank you for joining us on the WITA webinar platform. Corinne and her team as well for their help. David, did you want to jump in on anything there?
No, just to say thank you and really enjoyed being here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everybody. And we look forward to seeing everyone.